You watch colleagues with less experience get promoted while you work twice as hard and deliver better results. Every day you pour your energy into tasks that seem important, yet somehow you remain invisible when opportunities arise, while others effortlessly position themselves for success and advancement. The frustration eats at you as you wonder if merit even matters anymore in today's workplace. I am Sun Tzu, the ancient strategist whose positioning principles have guided victorious leaders for over 2,500 years on the deadliest battlefields imaginable. What I discovered about strategic positioning will transform how you navigate your workplace, giving you the advantage to win before the competition even realizes the game has begun. The battlefield may have changed from ancient China to modern offices, but the principles of position and timing remain as powerful today as they were when I first developed them. But first, like this video, subscribe for more ancient wisdom applied to modern challenges, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready for strategic mastery. Let me tell you how I discovered the power that would change warfare forever. In my youth, I was like many of you, intelligent, hardworking, but struggling to understand why some people seem to effortlessly rise while others, equally capable, remained overlooked. I spent countless hours in the libraries of ancient Wu, studying the military classics, memorizing the formations and tactics that had been passed down for generations. The bamboo scrolls I pored over contained the wisdom of ages, yet something felt incomplete. These ancient texts spoke of courage, discipline, and technique, but they missed something fundamental. I watched promising young officers follow every prescribed method, only to fail spectacularly in actual combat. Meanwhile, others who seemed less prepared somehow achieved remarkable victories. This puzzled me deeply. My first real awakening came during a minor border skirmish when I was still a junior officer. I had prepared meticulously, following every rule from the classical texts. My troops were well trained, my equipment was superior, and my tactics were textbook perfect. Yet within hours I found myself retreating in confusion, outmaneuvered by an enemy commander who seemed to break every rule I had studied. That night, sitting by my campfire in defeat, I realized that all my theoretical knowledge meant nothing if I didn't understand the deeper principles at work. The enemy hadn't won through superior force or better training. They had won through superior positioning. They had chosen when to engage, where to fight, and how to shape the battlefield to their advantage. While I had focused on the how of warfare, they had mastered the where and when. This revelation consumed me. I began to study not just military texts, but the patterns of nature itself. I watched how water flows around obstacles, always finding the path of least resistance, yet capable of carving through the hardest stone. I observed how predators in the wild don't simply attack with brute force. They position themselves, they wait, they strike when and where their prey is most vulnerable. I started documenting these observations on new bamboo scrolls, creating what would eventually become my life's work. But more importantly, I began to see that these principles extended far beyond the battlefield. Every human interaction, every competition, every struggle for advancement followed the same fundamental laws of positioning. The transformation from scholar to strategist wasn't just about learning new techniques. It was about developing an entirely different way of seeing the world. Where others saw random events, I began to see patterns. Where others saw fixed circumstances, I saw opportunities to reshape the terrain to my advantage. Where others accepted their position as given, I learned to actively create better positions. This shift in perspective didn't happen overnight. It required years of careful observation, countless experiments, and painful failures. But gradually, I developed a systematic approach to strategic positioning that would prove itself on battlefields across ancient China and eventually influence leaders for millennia to come. The principles I discovered aren't just about military strategy, they're about life strategy. They're about understanding that your current position isn't permanent, that you have more control over your circumstances than you realize, and that the right positioning can multiply your natural abilities exponentially. Today I want to share with you the same insights that transformed me from a struggling junior officer into a strategist whose name is still spoken with reverence over 2,000 years later. The moment that changed everything happened on a mist-covered morning in the mountains of ancient Wu. I had been given command of a small force, barely 300 men, and tasked with defending a crucial mountain pass against an enemy army of over 1,000 seasoned warriors. By every conventional measure, we were doomed. My silk map, which I still keep as a reminder of this pivotal lesson, showed what appeared to be an impossible situation. The enemy approached from the valley, below with overwhelming numbers, superior equipment, and years of battle experience. My young soldiers looked to me with a mixture of hope and terror, waiting for orders that could very well be their last. But as I studied that terrain more carefully, something remarkable began to emerge. The mountain pass wasn't just a location, it was a strategic asset waiting to be leveraged. The narrow confines meant that numbers became irrelevant. Only a few enemy soldiers could attack at once. The high ground gave my archers maximum range while limiting the enemy's ability to return fire effectively. Most importantly, the terrain itself would do half the fighting for us. Instead of preparing for a traditional battle, I positioned my forces to make the terrain work in our favor. I placed my best archers at the narrowest point of the pass, where they could rain arrows down on anyone attempting to advance. I positioned my spearmen behind natural rock formations that provided cover while creating choke points. I even had my men loosen rocks above the pass, ready to trigger a landslide if needed. When the enemy army arrived, they saw our small force and assumed an easy victory. Their commander, following conventional wisdom, ordered a direct assault up the mountain. What happened next was not so much a battle as a demonstration of how terrain can transform weakness into strength. The enemy's superior numbers became a liability as they crowded into the narrow pass. Their heavy armor, advantageous on flat ground, became a burden on the steep slopes. Their cavalry, their greatest strength, was rendered useless by the rocky terrain. Within hours, this superior force was retreating in disorder, having lost nearly half their men while we suffered minimal casualties. That victory taught me the most important lesson of my entire career. Terrain is everything. But here's what. I want you to understand, terrain isn't just about physical geography. In your workplace, in your career, in every competitive situation you face, there are terrains that can be leveraged to your advantage. The terrain in your office might be the timing of important meetings, the communication channels that matter most, the relationships that carry real influence, or the projects that truly impact the organization's future. Most people ignore these factors, focusing only on working harder within their current position. But the strategically minded person learns to shape and choose their terrain. This principle applies whether you're negotiating a promotion, leading a project, or building your professional reputation. The question isn't just, how hard am I working, but where am I choosing to compete, and how can I make that terrain work in my favor? After years of studying battlefields across ancient China, I developed a bronze compass that pointed not to magnetic north, but to the 5 directions of strategic power. This compass guided my understanding of terrain, and today I want to share how these same 5 terrains exist in your modern workplace. The first terrain is what I call accessible terrain. In warfare, this represents ground that both armies can occupy easily, flat, open areas where movement is unrestricted. In your workplace, accessible terrain consists of the relationships and visibility opportunities available to everyone. These are the company meetings everyone can attend, the networking events open to all employees, the public recognition programs, and the mentorship opportunities that any ambitious person can pursue. Most people make the mistake of avoiding accessible. terrain, thinking it's too crowded or competitive. But I learned that accessible terrain is often where you build the foundation for all other strategic advantages. During my early campaigns, I mastered the art of using accessible terrain to demonstrate my capabilities publicly, building the reputation that would later open doors to more advantageous positions. The second terrain is difficult terrain. This represents areas that are hard to enter but equally hard to leave, like marshlands or dense forests in warfare. In your workplace, difficult terrain includes complex office politics, challenging cross-departmental relationships, and the intricate hierarchies that govern real decision-making. Many people fear difficult terrain, but I discovered that those willing to navigate it skillfully often find less competition and greater rewards. I remember spending months learning to maneuver through the political complexities of the Wu court. It was exhausting and sometimes treacherous, but it taught me who really held power, how decisions were actually made, and where the hidden opportunities lay. Your organization's difficult terrain might be that crucial but challenging stakeholder relationship, the complex project everyone else avoids, or the politically sensitive initiative that could make or break careers. The third terrain is contentious terrain. This is ground that offers advantages to whoever seizes it first, but becomes a battleground if both sides attempt to control it simultaneously. In your workplace, contentious terrain appears whenever there are competing priorities, resource conflicts, or situations where multiple people want the same opportunity. The key to contentious terrain is speed and commitment. When I identified contentious ground in warfare, I moved decisively to claim it before my enemies could respond. In your career, this might mean being the first to volunteer for a high-visibility project, quickly establishing yourself as the go-to person for a particular expertise, or moving fast when a new position opens up. The fourth terrain is open terrain, which offers freedom of movement in all directions, but little natural advantage to either side. In warfare, battles on open terrain often come down to execution and superior strategy. In your workplace, open terrain exists during times of organizational change, market shifts, or when new technologies create opportunities that didn't exist. Before, open terrain rewards those who can move quickly and adapt their strategy as circumstances evolve. During periods of change in ancient kingdoms, I thrived by maintaining flexibility and being ready to pivot when new opportunities emerged. Your open terrain moments might be company reorganizations, industry disruptions, or when new leadership brings fresh perspectives. The fifth and most dangerous terrain is death terrain, situations where you must fight with everything you have because retreat means destruction. In warfare, this might be fighting with your back to a cliff or defending your last stronghold. In your workplace, death terrain appears during layoffs, major failures, or when your reputation or career is genuinely at stake. While death terrain is perilous, I learned it can also unleash extraordinary performance. When people have no choice but to succeed, they often discover capabilities they never knew they possessed. Some of my greatest victories came when my forces were on death terrain, fighting with the desperation and unity that only comes from having no alternative to victory. Every morning before dawn, I would sit before a polished bronze mirror, not to admire my appearance, but to practice the most difficult skill any strategist must master, seeing myself with absolute clarity. This mirror of self-mastery became my most important tool, more valuable than any weapon or tactical manual, because all strategic positioning begins with knowing exactly who you are. The day I nearly lost everything taught me why self-knowledge isn't optional, it's survival. I had been growing confident, perhaps overconfident, after several successful campaigns. When faced with a particularly challenging enemy, I assumed my previous tactics would work again. I positioned my forces based on my perceived strengths, ignored my actual weaknesses, and walked straight into a trap that cost me nearly half my army. Sitting in my tent that night, surrounded by the wounded and the defeated, I realized that my enemy had known me better than I knew myself. They had identified my tendency toward aggressive frontal assaults, my impatience with prolonged sieges, and my over-reliance on cavalry charges. While I had been studying their weaknesses, they had been studying mine and using them against me. That devastating lesson led me to develop what I call the 4 pillars of self-knowledge, a system I practice daily and that I believe every person seeking strategic advantage must master. The first pillar is understanding your true strengths, not the strengths you wish you had or the ones that look impressive to others, but the capabilities that consistently deliver results for you. I discovered that my real strength wasn't in direct confrontation as I had assumed, but in reading terrain and positioning forces for maximum advantage. In your workplace, your true strengths might be different from what your job description emphasizes. Perhaps you're excellent at building consensus among difficult personalities, or you have an unusual ability to see patterns in complex data, or you naturally inspire trust in high-pressure situations. The second pillar is acknowledging your genuine weaknesses. This requires brutal honesty because our minds naturally protect us from uncomfortable truths. I had to admit that I was impatient, that I sometimes made decisions too quickly when emotions ran high, and that I struggled with the political aspects of military leadership. These weren't character flaws to be ashamed of. They were strategic realities to be managed. In your career, you might need to acknowledge that you're not naturally gifted at public speaking, that you struggle with detailed administrative work, or that you find it difficult to say no to additional commitments. The third pillar is recognizing your core motivations. What truly drives you when external pressures are removed? I discovered that I wasn't motivated primarily by glory or conquest, as I had thought, but by the intellectual challenge of solving complex strategic puzzles. This insight helped me choose battles and positions that aligned with my deepest motivations, leading to both better performance and greater satisfaction. Your core motivations might be the desire to build something lasting, to help others succeed, to solve difficult problems, or to create order from chaos. The fourth pillar is facing your hidden fears. The fears we don't acknowledge control us more than the ones we confront directly. I had to admit that I feared being seen as weak or indecisive, which sometimes pushed me toward unnecessarily aggressive actions. I also feared the political complexities of leadership, which made me avoid certain strategic opportunities. Once I acknowledged these fears, I could develop strategies to work with them rather than being controlled by them. Most people fail at strategic positioning because they position themselves based on who they think they should be rather than who they actually are. They take on roles that don't match their strengths, compete in areas where their weaknesses are exposed, pursue goals that don't align with their true motivations, and make decisions driven by unacknowledged fears. My daily practice with the bronze mirror taught me that self-knowledge isn't a destination, it's an ongoing discipline. As circumstances change and we grow, our understanding of ourselves must evolve as well. The silk scroll that saved my most important campaign contained nothing but names, habits, and seemingly insignificant details about my enemy commanders. While other generals focused on troop counts and weapon inventories, I had spent months building a network of informants who could tell me something far more valuable: how my opponents thought, what they feared, and where their judgment was most likely to fail. This intelligence network wasn't just about military espionage. It was about understanding human nature at the deepest level. I learned that battles are won not just by superior force, but by superior understanding of the people you're competing against. The same principle that guided my ancient spy networks can transform how you navigate your modern workplace competition. The breakthrough that changed everything came during a prolonged siege where conventional tactics had failed for months. My direct assaults were being repelled, my supply lines were stretched thin, and time was running against me. Then one of my informants brought me a seemingly trivial piece of information. The enemy commander always inspected the eastern wall, personally at dawn, and he had a deep fear of being seen as cowardly by his officers. This tiny insight opened up an entirely new strategy. Instead of continuing the costly frontal assaults, I staged a false retreat while secretly positioning my best forces near the eastern wall. At dawn, when the enemy commander made his routine inspection, I launched a coordinated attack that appeared to be a desperate last assault. His fear of appearing cowardly prevented him from ordering an immediate retreat, and his predictable positioning during the inspection made him vulnerable at exactly the right moment. That victory taught me that information is the ultimate strategic weapon, but only if you know what kind of information matters. Over the years, I developed a systematic approach to intelligence gathering that focuses on 5 crucial types of knowledge about your competition. First, understand their decision-making patterns. How do they typically respond to pressure? Do they make choices quickly or slowly? Are they more influenced by data or by relationships? In your workplace, this might mean observing how your colleagues handle challenging projects, how they respond to criticism, or what kinds of arguments they find most persuasive. Second, identify their core strengths and how they prefer to leverage them. Every competitor has abilities they rely on most heavily, and understanding these patterns allows you to anticipate their strategies. Perhaps your colleague always builds consensus through one-on-one conversations, or maybe your manager makes decisions primarily based on financial data rather than strategic considerations. Third, discover their genuine weaknesses and blind spots. Not the obvious flaws everyone can see, but the subtle vulnerabilities they themselves might not recognize. This isn't about exploiting people maliciously, but about understanding the complete competitive landscape. Maybe someone is brilliant with analysis but struggles with presentation, or they're excellent at starting projects but poor at finishing them. Fourth, learn their motivations and fears. What do they really want to achieve, and what keeps them awake at night? Understanding these deeper drivers helps you predict how they'll behave in crucial moments and identify opportunities for collaboration or competition. Fifth, map their relationships and influence networks. Who do they turn to for advice? Who supports their initiatives? Who opposes them? In any organization, the formal hierarchy is only part of the story. The informal networks of influence often matter more. Building this kind of intelligence network in your workplace doesn't require deception or manipulation. It simply requires paying attention, asking thoughtful questions, and being genuinely interested in understanding the people around you. The best intelligence often comes from casual conversations, careful observation during meetings, and listening to what people say about their challenges and aspirations. Remember, the goal isn't to harm your competition, but to position yourself strategically based on complete information rather than assumptions and guesswork. The jade tiger that sits beside my scrolls represents the most difficult lesson I ever learned, that sometimes the greatest strength is the discipline to wait. This carved figurine reminds me of the battle I nearly lost by acting too quickly, and how I discovered that timing is often more important than talent, resources, or even superior strategy. The enemy had positioned themselves in what appeared to be a vulnerable formation spread across a valley with obvious weaknesses in their flanks. My younger officers were eager for attack, my troops were ready for battle, and every tactical manual I had studied suggested that immediate assault was the correct response. The opportunity seemed perfect, almost too good to be true. That should have been my warning. Against my deeper instincts, I allowed the pressure of expectations and the apparent perfection of the moment to override my judgment. I ordered the attack, committing my forces to what I believed would be a swift and decisive victory. Within hours, I realized I had walked into an elaborate trap. The vulnerable formation was bait, the weak flanks were reinforced with hidden reserves, and my eagerness had blinded me to signs that should have been obvious. As I watched my forces struggle against a carefully prepared defense, I understood that my enemy had used my own impatience against me. They had created the appearance of opportunity specifically to trigger premature action. While I had been focused on seizing the moment, they had been focused on creating the right moment for their purposes, not mine. That painful lesson taught me to distinguish between real opportunities and apparent ones, between being ready to act and being compelled to act. I developed what I call the framework of strategic timing, which has guided my decisions ever since. The first element is recognizing the difference between urgency and importance. Urgent situations demand immediate response, but important opportunities often require patient preparation. In your workplace, an urgent email might need a quick reply, but an important career opportunity might require months of positioning before you're ready to pursue it effectively. The second element is understanding that preparation and patience compound each other. Every day you wait strategically is a day you can use to strengthen your position, gather more intelligence, or develop additional capabilities. I learned to use waiting periods not as empty time, but as active preparation time. The third element is developing the discipline to act when the timing is right, rather than when the pressure is highest. This requires incredible self-control, because external pressures often push us toward premature action. Your colleagues might be advancing quickly, your manager might be pressing for immediate results, or opportunities might seem to be passing you by. But I discovered that the right moment has certain characteristics you can learn to recognize. The right moment typically comes when you're fully prepared, when your competition is not, when external circumstances align with your strengths, and when the potential impact justifies the risk involved. The fourth element is learning to create your own timing rather than simply reacting to circumstances. Instead of waiting for perfect opportunities to appear, strategic patience often means gradually shaping conditions so that the right moment emerges naturally. This might mean building relationships over months before you need them, developing expertise in areas that aren't yet critical, but will be soon, or positioning yourself near emerging opportunities before they become obvious to everyone else. Strategic patience is perhaps the hardest skill for ambitious people to master, because it feels like inaction when you want to be moving forward. But I learned that patience isn't passivity. It's active preparation combined with disciplined timing. The tiger waits motionlessly for hours, but when it strikes with devastating effectiveness. In your career, strategic patience might mean declining opportunities that aren't quite right while you prepare for ones that are perfect. Or it might mean enduring a difficult situation while you build the capabilities and relationships needed to change it. The ceremonial ring I wear bears the seal of an alliance that saved not just my army, but taught me that individual brilliance means nothing without strategic relationships. This alliance seal represents the moment I learned that positioning yourself as indispensable to the right people is often more powerful than any personal capability you can develop. I was facing the most desperate situation of my military career. Surrounded by enemy forces that outnumbered mine 3-1, with supply lines cut and winter approaching, my options appeared to be surrender or certain destruction. My own abilities as a strategist, all the positioning principles I had mastered, seemed inadequate against such overwhelming odds. But months earlier, I had formed what seemed like a minor alliance with General Wei, commander of a smaller force in a neighboring territory. This alliance hadn't been born from grand strategy, but from mutual respect and small acts of assistance during previous campaigns. I had shared intelligence that helped him avoid an ambush. He had provided supplies when my forces were delayed by storms, and we had developed a relationship based on trust and reciprocal benefit. When my desperate situation became clear, General Wei marched his forces through hostile territory to reach me, not because of any formal treaty, but because our alliance had created genuine mutual loyalty. His arrival not only broke the siege, but demonstrated to other potential allies that I was someone worth supporting. Within weeks, what had been a desperate defensive position became the foundation for a coordinated campaign that ultimately secured the entire region. This experience revealed that strategic relationships aren't just about networking or accumulating contacts. They're about positioning yourself within a web of mutual interests that multiply your individual capabilities exponentially. The first principle of strategic alliances is identifying valuable potential allies before you need them. Too many people wait until they're in crisis to start building relationships, but by then, it's too late. The most powerful alliances are formed during times of strength, when you can offer value rather than simply asking for help. In your workplace, valuable allies aren't necessarily the most senior people or the most obviously powerful ones. They're people whose capabilities complement yours, whose success you can genuinely support, and who face challenges where your strengths can make a meaningful difference. The colleague who excels at client relationships might be a perfect ally for someone who's brilliant at technical solutions but struggles with presentation. The second principle is building relationships through consistent small actions rather than dramatic gestures. My alliance with General Wei wasn't forged through grand proclamations, but through reliable, helpful behavior over time. In your career, this might mean regularly sharing useful information, offering assistance on projects outside your direct responsibilities, or simply being someone others can count on for honest feedback and support. The third principle is positioning yourself as indispensable to your allies' success. This doesn't mean making yourself the bottleneck for everything they do, but rather becoming someone whose unique capabilities, perspective, or resources consistently help them achieve their objectives. When your success becomes linked to their success, they have strong incentives to support your advancement. The fourth principle is maintaining alliance reciprocity. Strategic relationships must benefit both parties over time, or they become unsustainable. This means being as committed to your allies' objectives as you expect them to be to yours, and being willing to invest resources and effort in their success, even when the immediate benefit to you isn't obvious. The fifth principle is understanding that the strongest alliances often form between people who are strong in different areas rather than similar ones. Competitors rarely make good allies, but people with complementary strengths can create partnerships where the combined capability far exceeds what either could achieve alone. In modern workplaces, these alliances might manifest as cross-functional partnerships, mentoring relationships, industry connections, or even informal support networks within your organization. The key is recognizing that individual achievement has limits, but strategic alliances can break through those limits by combining different strengths, resources, and perspectives. Remember, lone wolves may appear impressive, but they always lose to coordinated packs. The most successful people in any field understand that their positioning depends not just on their individual capabilities, but on their ability to build and maintain strategic relationships that amplify their impact. The wooden strategy board I created to teach my officers bears the marks of countless lessons about positioning, but none more important than the fundamental principle that elevation creates advantage. This board game, with its carved hills and valleys, taught them what I learned through bitter experience, that controlling the high ground isn't just about physical elevation, it's about claiming any position that gives you a commanding view and superior leverage. The siege that taught me this lesson began with what appeared to be an impossible task. The enemy had fortified themselves on a hilltop citadel, surrounded by walls and protected by natural barriers. Conventional wisdom suggested a prolonged siege or costly direct assault up the slopes. But as I studied the terrain more carefully, I realized that the highest ground wasn't actually the enemy's position. It was a neighboring peak that everyone, including the enemy, had dismissed as irrelevant. While the enemy focused on defending their obvious high ground, I spent weeks secretly positioning my forces on the truly commanding elevation. From this position, I could observe all their movements, direct artillery fire down into their compound, and coordinate attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. What had seemed like their greatest advantage became their greatest vulnerability. Once I controlled the real high ground. This experience taught me that high ground comes in many forms, and the most valuable positions are often those that others don't recognize as advantageous. In your workplace, the equivalent of high ground might be access to information before others receive it, relationships with key decision makers, expertise in areas about to become critical, or positions that provide visibility into multiple parts of the organization. The first type of high ground is information advantage. Just as physical elevation lets you see further across a battlefield, information elevation lets you see further into the future of your organization and industry. This might mean developing relationships with people who know about strategic plans before they're announced, staying connected to industry trends before they become obvious, or positioning yourself to hear about opportunities before they're widely available. The second type is relationship advantage. Some positions in any organization provide access to influential people and important conversations. These aren't necessarily the most senior positions, but they're positions that create regular interaction with decision makers. The executive assistant who schedules meetings often knows more about real priorities than many managers. The project coordinator who works across departments often understands organizational dynamics better than people within individual silos. The third type is expertise advantage. Becoming the go-to person for specific knowledge or capabilities creates a form of high ground that's difficult for others to assault. But the key is developing expertise in areas that are about to become critical, rather than areas that are already recognized as important. When everyone sees the value of particular expertise, the competition for that high ground becomes intense. The fourth type is access advantage. Some positions provide access to resources, tools, or opportunities that others lack. This might be access to senior leadership, access to customers or external partners, access to confidential information, or access to development opportunities that can accelerate your career. The fifth type is visibility advantage. Positions that provide visibility into multiple parts of the organization create high ground because they allow you to see patterns and opportunities that others miss. Cross-functional roles, project management positions, and assignments that require coordination across departments often provide this type of advantage. The key to claiming high ground is recognizing valuable positions before they become obviously valuable to everyone else. This requires thinking several moves ahead, understanding where your organization and industry are heading, and positioning yourself near emerging opportunities before the competition arrives. Once you've identified potential high ground, the next challenge is claiming it without triggering unnecessary competition. Sometimes this means gradually building the capabilities needed for a position before applying for it. Sometimes it means volunteering for challenging assignments that others avoid. Sometimes it means demonstrating value in a particular area until you become the obvious choice when opportunities arise. Remember, high ground isn't just about reaching an elevated position, it's about systematically improving your strategic position over time. The bronze medallion I carry commemorates the fastest victory of my career, a campaign that ended a year-long stalemate in just 48 hours. This swift arrow medallion reminds me that sometimes the most powerful strategic position is the ability to move faster than your opponents can react, striking before they realize the game has changed. The stalemate had dragged on for months. Two evenly matched armies faced each other across a river valley, each waiting for the other to make a mistake. Traditional siege tactics were proving ineffective. Supply lines were straining both sides, and my commanders were growing restless. Every conventional strategy had been attempted and countered. The situation seemed destined to continue indefinitely, but while my enemy focused on the obvious battleground, I had been quietly preparing for something entirely different. During those long months of apparent inaction, I had been building bridges, upriver, training my forces for rapid night movements, and stockpiling supplies at strategic points along alternate routes. When I finally moved, it wasn't where anyone expected, and it happened faster than anyone thought possible. In a single night, I moved my entire force 20 miles upriver, crossed at the prepared position, and positioned my army behind the enemy's main camp. By dawn, what had been a frontal stalemate became a hopeless trap for my opponents. They surrendered within hours, not because they lacked the strength to fight, but because they couldn't adapt quickly enough to the completely changed strategic situation. This victory taught me that speed isn't just about moving fast, it's about compressing the decision-making cycle so dramatically that your opponents can't respond effectively. While they're still analyzing the situation, you've already implemented your solution and moved on to the next challenge. The first element of the lightning strike approach is preparation in silence. True speed in execution requires extensive preparation that others don't see. My 48-hour victory was actually the result of months of careful positioning, resource gathering, and capability building. In your workplace, this might mean developing skills quietly before you need them, building relationships before opportunities arise, or researching options thoroughly before situations become urgent. The second element is recognizing the decision-making windows when speed provides maximum advantage. Not every situation rewards rapid action, but certain moments create opportunities for those who can move decisively while others are still processing what's happening. These moments often occur during organizational changes, market shifts, crises, or when new information suddenly changes the competitive landscape. The third element is maintaining systems that enable rapid execution. Speed without preparation leads to mistakes, but preparation without the ability to act quickly leads to missed opportunities. I developed protocols that allowed my forces to move rapidly when needed, predetermined communication methods, pre-positioned resources, and trained procedures that could be executed without lengthy deliberation. The fourth element is understanding that speed often matters more than perfection. While others are developing the perfect plan, the strategically fast person implements a good plan immediately and adapts as new information emerges. This doesn't mean being reckless, but it does mean accepting that perfect information and perfect timing rarely exist simultaneously. The fifth element is using speed to create psychological advantages. When you consistently respond faster than expected, people begin to perceive you as more capable and decisive than you might actually be. This reputation for rapid, effective action becomes a strategic asset that opens doors and creates opportunities. In your modern workplace, the lightning strike approach might manifest as being the first to volunteer for high-visibility projects, rapidly developing expertise in emerging areas, quickly building relationships with new team members or clients, or moving fast when new positions become available. But remember, speed without strategy is just chaos. The most effective lightning strikes are carefully prepared, precisely targeted, and executed with enough force to achieve decisive results. Like the swift arrow that hits its target, your rapid actions should be aimed with precision and backed by solid preparation. The key is developing the capability for speed while maintaining the judgment to know when to use it. The fractured shield that hangs in my study serves as a reminder of one of warfare's most powerful principles, that a unified enemy is often invincible, but a divided enemy defeats itself. This broken shield once belonged to a coalition of forces that should have crushed my smaller army, but instead destroyed each other through divisions I carefully cultivated. I faced an alliance of 3 powerful warlords who had set aside their traditional rivalries to eliminate what they saw as a common threat: my growing influence in the region. Individually, I could have defeated any of them, but together they commanded overwhelming force. Direct confrontation would have been suicide, yet retreat would have meant abandoning everything I had worked to build. The solution came from understanding that their alliance was built on necessity rather than trust. Each warlord had joined the coalition primarily to prevent the others from gaining too much advantage from my defeat. Their cooperation was fragile, held together only by their shared perception of me as the immediate threat. Instead of fighting their combined force, I began fighting their unity. Through carefully placed intelligence, I let each warlord discover that the others were secretly negotiating with me for separate peace deals. Through strategic retreats and tactical victories, I made it appear that I was receiving support from within their alliance. Most importantly, I ensured that the benefits of any victory would be distributed unequally, making each leader question whether their allies deserved an equal share of the spoils. Within weeks, their solid alliance began developing cracks. Mutual suspicion replaced mutual support. Resources that should have been coordinated against me were instead used to spy on each other. Meetings that should have focused on strategy became arguments about loyalty and fairness. By the time they realized what was happening, their coalition had fractured beyond repair, and I was able to defeat them one by one. This victory taught me that division isn't about creating enemies. It's about revealing the natural tensions that already exist and allowing them to work in your favor. In every coalition, every team, every organization contains inherent tensions between competing interests. The strategic person learns to recognize these fault lines and position themselves advantageously when they inevitably appear. The first principle of strategic division is identifying natural fractures before they become obvious. These might be competing priorities within your organization, personality conflicts between key players, resource competition between departments, or philosophical differences about direction and strategy. The key is recognizing these tensions while they're still manageable, rather than waiting until they explode into open conflict. The second principle is positioning yourself as the solution rather than as part of the problem. When divisions emerge, there is always an opportunity for someone to serve as the bridge, the mediator, or the unifying alternative. This requires maintaining good relationships with multiple sides and avoiding the temptation to take sides prematurely. The third principle is understanding that competition fragments opposition more effectively than direct confrontation. When you attack a unified group directly, you often strengthen their unity against the common threat. But when you create situations where they must compete with each other for limited resources or opportunities, their natural self-interest begins to override their collective interests. The fourth principle is allowing divisions to develop naturally rather than forcing them artificially. Manufactured conflicts often backfire because they're recognized as manipulation. But when you simply create conditions where existing tensions can express themselves, the resulting divisions appear natural and inevitable. The fifth principle is maintaining ethical boundaries even when using division strategically. There is a difference between recognizing and leveraging natural organizational tensions and maliciously destroying relationships for personal gain. The most effective strategic division actually serves the broader organization by forcing the resolution of underlying conflicts that were hindering overall performance. In your workplace, these principles might apply when dealing with competing stakeholders on a project, managing conflicting priorities from different managers, or navigating situations where multiple people want the same promotion or resources. The goal isn't to create destructive conflict, but to position yourself advantageously when natural conflicts arise. Remember, unity is strength, but forced unity is often weakness disguised as strength. The strategically minded person learns to distinguish between genuine alignment and superficial cooperation, positioning themselves to benefit when the difference becomes clear. The Phantom Regiment banner that I keep reminds me of my greatest deception, a victory won not through superior force, but but through appearing to be somewhere I wasn't, while striking where I couldn't possibly be. This false flag represents the delicate art of strategic misdirection, where perception becomes more powerful than reality itself. The enemy had studied my tactics for months, analyzing my previous campaigns and developing counters to my preferred strategies. They knew I favored flanking movements, they expected my cavalry charges, and they had prepared for my typical positioning approaches. In essence, they had learned to fight the Sun Tzu they thought they knew, but while they prepared for my expected tactics, I was preparing something entirely different. I created an elaborate deception using the Phantom Regiment banner and a small force of volunteers. This decoy army, positioned exactly where the enemy anticipated my main attack, displayed all the characteristics of my usual approach, the formations I typically used, the timing I normally preferred, even the specific signals and movements that had become my signature. Meanwhile, my real force approached from the opposite direction, using terrain and timing that contradicted everything in my military history. When the enemy committed their reserves to counter my expected flanking maneuver, they left their actual weak point completely exposed to an attack they never saw coming. The victory was decisive, but more importantly, it taught me that strategic deception isn't about dishonesty. It's about controlling information and managing expectations. The difference between deception and manipulation lies in the intent and the outcome. Strategic deception serves legitimate objectives and often benefits all parties by avoiding unnecessary conflict. The first principle of strategic misdirection is understanding that people make decisions based on the information they have, not the information you have. This creates opportunities to shape their decision-making by carefully controlling what information they receive and when they receive it. In your workplace, this might mean managing the timing of announcements, controlling the flow of information about your projects, or positioning your capabilities in ways that create specific impressions. The second principle is using your own patterns against your competitors' expectations. If you're known for certain approaches or preferences, people will prepare for those approaches. But if you occasionally act completely contrary to your established patterns, you can achieve surprise, even against opponents who think they know you well. This might mean pursuing opportunities that seem inconsistent with your background, or developing expertise in areas where you're not expected to excel. The third principle is creating multiple viable interpretations of your actions. When your competitors can't be certain about your true intentions, they must divide their attention and resources among multiple possible responses. In your career, this might mean pursuing several different opportunities simultaneously or developing capabilities that could lead in multiple directions. The fourth principle is distinguishing between strategic ambiguity and outright deception. Strategic ambiguity involves being genuinely unclear about your next moves, while deception involves actively misleading others. The first is often ethical and effective, while the second can damage your reputation and relationships if discovered. The fifth principle is maintaining the ability to deliver on whatever impression you've created. The Phantom Regiment worked because I actually had the capability to execute the attack that everyone expected. If your misdirection leads people to expect certain performance from you, you must be able to deliver that performance if called upon. In modern workplace applications, strategic misdirection might involve managing expectations about your timeline for major decisions, controlling information about your job search or career plans, or positioning yourself for opportunities without alerting competitors to your intentions. The key is remembering that strategic deception should serve legitimate objectives and maintain ethical boundaries. The goal isn't to harm others, but to position yourself advantageously in competitive situations where complete transparency would be strategically disadvantageous, like the Phantom Regiment that drew enemy attention while my real forces struck. Elsewhere, Effective misdirection creates opportunities for decisive action, while others are focused on the wrong priorities. The tactical withdrawal map that I treasure above many of my victory scrolls shows not a defeat, but the retreat that positioned me for my greatest triumph. This silk scroll represents one of the hardest lessons in strategic positioning, that sometimes stepping back is the most powerful way to move forward, and that retreat requires more courage than advance when everyone expects you to fight. He faced an enemy force that held every apparent advantage: superior numbers, better positioning, and the support of local populations. My advisors urged immediate attack, arguing that retreat would be seen as weakness and would encourage other enemies to challenge me. The pressure to fight was enormous, both from external expectations and from my own warrior's pride. But as I studied the strategic situation more deeply, I realized that the enemy's apparent advantages were actually creating vulnerabilities they didn't recognize. Their large force required enormous supplies, their strong position made them static and predictable, and their local support made them overconfident. More importantly, I understood that winter was approaching, and the terrain that favored them in autumn would favor me dramatically once the seasons changed. The decision to retreat was one of the most difficult of my career. It meant accepting the appearance of defeat, disappointing my supporters, and risking the morale of my forces. But I understood that strategic positioning sometimes requires sacrificing short-term perceptions for long-term advantages. My retreat wasn't a panicked flight, it was a carefully orchestrated repositioning. I withdrew to terrain that I had prepared months earlier, positions that would allow me to control the pace and nature of future engagements. During the retreat, I maintained discipline, preserved my force's strength, and gathered intelligence about my enemy's weaknesses. When winter arrived, the situation reversed completely. The enemy's large force became a liability as supplies grew scarce. Their static position became a trap as the weather made movement difficult. Their overconfidence became vulnerability as they failed to adapt to changing conditions. Within months, I was able to return and achieve a decisive victory against the same forces that had seemed invincible during our first encounter. This experience taught me that strategic retreat isn't about giving up, it's about repositioning for future advantage. The courage to retreat when others expect you to fight often creates opportunities that aggressive action would have destroyed. The first principle of strategic retreat is recognizing when your current position is fundamentally unsustainable. This requires honest assessment of your resources, capabilities, and prospects for success. In your workplace, this might mean acknowledging that a project is doomed, that a relationship has become toxic, or that a career path isn't leading where you want to go. The second principle is retreating to a position of strength, rather than simply retreating from weakness. Effective retreat involves moving toward better opportunities rather than just escaping current problems. This might mean leaving a dysfunctional team to join a high-performing one, or stepping back from one opportunity to position yourself for a better one. The third principle is maintaining your capabilities and reputation during the retreat. How? You retreat often matters more than why you retreat. Professional, dignified withdrawal preserves relationships and options for the future, while desperate or destructive retreat burns bridges you might need later. The fourth principle is using retreat time for preparation and strengthening. The period between retreating from one position and advancing to the next should be used to develop new capabilities, build stronger relationships, or address weaknesses that contributed to the original situation. The fifth principle is timing your return for maximum advantage. Strategic retreat only works if it eventually leads to strategic advance. This requires patience to wait for the right moment and wisdom to recognize when conditions have shifted in your favor. In modern workplace applications, strategic retreat might involve stepping back from a failing project before it damages your reputation, leaving a toxic work environment before it affects your performance, or declining an opportunity that seems attractive but would ultimately limit your options. Remember, the warrior who retreats today may return tomorrow in a stronger position, but the warrior who fights at the wrong time and place may never get another chance to retreat. The ceremonial spear that stands in my armory represents the moment I learned that victory belongs not to those who are strongest everywhere, but to those who are strongest at the decisive point. This concentrated strike spear reminds me of the mathematics of strategic power, that focusing all your resources at the crucial moment and place can overcome seemingly impossible odds. I faced an army nearly twice the size of mine, led by a competent general who had never lost a major battle. On paper, the engagement seemed hopeless. My enemy had more soldiers, better equipment, superior cavalry, and the advantage of fighting on familiar terrain. Every conventional analysis suggested that I should avoid direct confrontation at all costs. But as I studied the enemy's dispositions and battle plans, I discovered something crucial. Their strength was also their weakness. Because they were powerful across their entire line, they had distributed their forces evenly, creating no single point of overwhelming advantage. They were strong everywhere, which meant they were decisive nowhere. I made the opposite choice. Instead of matching their deployment, I concentrated nearly 70% of my total force at one specific point in their line, a section that seemed well defended but was actually held by their least experienced troops. Meanwhile, I left minimal forces everywhere else, creating the appearance of weakness across most of the battlefield. When the battle began, the enemy's superior numbers meant nothing at the point of contact. At the decisive location, I had concentrated overwhelming force against a small section of their line. The breakthrough was swift and devastating, and once I had shattered their formation at that crucial point, their numerical superiority became a liability as confusion spread and their coordinated defense collapsed. This victory taught me that strategic concentration is about much more than military tactics. It's about understanding where and when. Focused effort can create disproportionate results. The same principle that won battles can transform careers and organizations. The first element of strategic concentration is identifying your decisive point. This is the specific area where success or failure will determine the overall outcome. In your workplace, the decisive point might be a particular relationship that influences all other relationships, a specific skill that multiplies all your other capabilities, or a crucial project that will define your reputation and future opportunities. The second element is accepting that concentration requires sacrifice. You cannot be strong everywhere simultaneously. Focusing overwhelming force at the decisive point means accepting weakness elsewhere. This might mean declining good opportunities to pursue great ones, or temporarily neglecting areas that seem important but aren't actually decisive. The third element is timing your concentration precisely. Overwhelming force is only effective if applied at the right moment. Too early and you exhaust your resources before the decisive moment arrives. Too late and the opportunity passes. This requires careful observation of changing conditions and the discipline to wait for the optimal moment. The fourth element is understanding that concentration multiplies existing capabilities rather than creating new ones. You must already possess the resources, skills, and relationships needed for success. Concentration focuses these existing assets for maximum impact rather than magically creating abilities you don't have. The fifth element is maintaining the capability to sustain your concentrated effort long enough to achieve decisive results. Many people make the mistake of concentrating their resources briefly and then dispersing them before the breakthrough occurs. True strategic concentration requires the stamina to maintain focused effort through the entire cycle of success. Your career, this might mean concentrating all your professional development effort on mastering one critical skill rather than dabbling in many areas. It might mean focusing intensively on building relationships with a few key decision-makers rather than networking broadly but superficially. It might mean committing completely to one high-impact project rather than spreading your attention. Across multiple initiatives, the mathematics of concentration are compelling. If you focus 70% of your resources where your competition is focusing 30% of theirs, you achieve more than double their impact at that point. This advantage often proves decisive even when they have greater total resources. Remember, scattered effort produces scattered results, but concentrated effort at the right point and time can overcome almost any disadvantage. The key is having the wisdom to identify your decisive point and the courage to commit your resources completely to that crucial battle. The Mind Fortress Scroll contains my deepest insights into the most powerful battlefield of all, the human mind. This ancient parchment reminds me that while armies clash on physical terrain, the real war is fought in the realm of perception, confidence, and psychological positioning. The battle I won before a single sword was drawn taught me that mental positioning often determines victory more decisively than any physical advantage. My enemy commanded a force renowned throughout the region for their ferocity and previous victories. Their reputation preceded them like a storm cloud, and I watched my own soldiers' confidence waver as stories of their opponent's prowess spread through our camp. The psychological battle was being lost before the physical confrontation even began, but I recognized that reputation is a double-edged weapon. While my enemy's fearsome reputation intimidated my forces, it also created enormous pressure on them to live up to their own legend. More importantly, I realized that reputations are built on past performances, and past performances don't always predict future results under different conditions. Instead of trying to match their psychological intimidation directly, I began reshaping the narrative entirely. Through carefully placed intelligence, I ensured that stories reached my enemy about my own tactical innovations, my intimate knowledge of the local terrain, and my forces' desperate motivation to defend their homeland. More subtly, I began questioning whether their previous victories had been against truly comparable opponents under similar conditions. By the time we actually engaged, the psychological dynamics had shifted dramatically. My enemy arrived expecting to face the same type of demoralized opposition they had encountered before, but instead found themselves confronting forces that seemed unnaturally confident and prepared. Their own confidence, built on past successes, began to crack when their initial probes met unexpected resistance. The actual battle became almost secondary to the psychological transformation that had already occurred. My forces fought with the confidence of defenders protecting something precious, while my enemy fought with the growing doubt of warriors whose invincible reputation was being questioned for the first time. This experience revealed that psychological positioning operates on multiple levels simultaneously, and mastering it requires understanding both your own mental state and your ability to influence others' perceptions. The first level is personal psychological positioning, managing your own confidence, fear, and mental clarity under pressure. This requires honest self-assessment combined with deliberate practices that maintain mental strength. In your workplace, this might mean developing routines that keep you calm during high-stress situations, building confidence through thorough preparation, or learning to separate temporary setbacks from permanent limitations. The second level is relational psychological positioning, influencing how others perceive your capabilities, intentions, and likely actions. This isn't about deception, but about presenting your authentic strengths in ways that create respect and influence. You might establish credibility by consistently delivering on commitments, demonstrate expertise through thoughtful questions and insights, or build confidence by remaining calm when others become reactive. The third level is situational psychological positioning, shaping how others interpret events and circumstances. This involves helping people see situations from perspectives that favor your objectives while remaining truthful and ethical. You might frame challenges as opportunities, position setbacks as learning experiences, or help others recognize the potential benefits of approaches they initially resist. The fourth level is competitive psychological positioning, managing the mental dynamics between yourself and your professional competition. This requires understanding their psychological strengths and vulnerabilities while maintaining your own mental clarity. You might choose to compete in areas where your psychological approach gives you advantages, or avoid competitions where others have psychological superiority. The fifth level is organizational psychological positioning, influencing the overall mental climate and cultural dynamics within your workplace. This might involve becoming known for particular attitudes or approaches that serve your strategic objectives, contributing to conversations in ways that establish your expertise or helping shape how your organization thinks about challenges and opportunities. The key insight is that psychological positioning is ultimately about authenticity amplified by strategic awareness. The most powerful psychological positions are built on genuine capabilities and authentic strengths, but presented and positioned in ways that maximize their impact. Remember, the battle for minds is often won or lost before the battle for resources even begins. Position yourself psychologically with as much care as you position yourself physically, and you'll discover that many conflicts resolve in your favor before they actually begin. The flowing water medallion I wear represents the campaign that nearly destroyed me because I refused to adapt, and the lesson that saved my career, that no position, however strong, remains advantageous forever. This silver piece reminds me that, like water, which maintains its essential nature while taking the shape of any container, the strategically positioned person must learn to be flexible in approach while remaining constant in purpose. I had achieved a series of victories using a particular strategic approach that had proven devastatingly effective. My positioning tactics, my timing, my methods of intelligence gathering, everything had worked perfectly across multiple campaigns. Success had bred confidence, and confidence had bred rigidity. I began to believe that I had discovered universal principles that would work in any situation. When I encountered an enemy who had studied my methods and prepared specifically to counter them, I faced a choice: adapt my approach or persist with proven tactics. Pride and overconfidence led me to choose persistence. I was convinced that superior execution of my established methods would overcome any countermeasures. The result was nearly catastrophic. My enemy had anticipated every move I made because they were the same moves that had brought me previous victories. My predictable positioning became my greatest vulnerability. What had been strategic advantages became strategic traps because I had failed to recognize that circumstances had changed, and my position needed to evolve accordingly. The recovery from this near disaster taught me that adaptation isn't abandoning your principles, it's applying your principles flexibly as conditions change. Water doesn't stop being water when it flows around an obstacle. It remains true to its nature while changing its path. The first principle of adaptive positioning is maintaining constant awareness of changing conditions. Most people become so focused on executing their current strategy that they miss signals indicating that the environment has shifted. This requires developing what I call peripheral strategic vision, the ability to monitor broader patterns while managing immediate tasks. In your workplace, changing conditions might include new leadership with different priorities, marketing, shifts that alter your organization's focus, technological changes that make certain skills more or less valuable, or competitive pressures that require different approaches to success. The second principle is distinguishing between your core strengths and your current tactics. Your fundamental capabilities and values should remain consistent, but the ways you apply them must evolve with circumstances. I learned to separate my essential strategic principles from the specific methods I used to implement them. The third principle is preparing multiple contingent positions before you need them. Adaptation is most effective when you've already considered alternative approaches and developed the capabilities to implement them. This might mean building diverse skill sets, maintaining relationships across different parts of your organization, or understanding multiple paths to your objectives. The fourth principle is recognizing the optimal timing for position changes. Adapting too quickly can appear inconsistent and damage your credibility, while adapting too slowly can leave you vulnerable to changed circumstances. The key is identifying the indicators that signal when adaptation is necessary versus when persistence is more appropriate. The fifth principle is maintaining momentum during transitions. The most dangerous moments in strategic positioning occur when you're shifting from one position to another. During these transitions, you're temporarily vulnerable because you've abandoned your old advantages without fully establishing new ones. In your career, adaptive positioning might mean evolving your expertise as your industry changes, adjusting your communication style to work effectively with new leadership, or modifying your career goals as new opportunities emerge that weren't previously available. Chateaubriand, Fab, challenges maintaining enough consistency to build reputation and credibility while remaining flexible enough to capitalize on changing opportunities. This requires what I call principled flexibility, staying true to your core values and fundamental strengths while remaining open to new ways of applying them. Like water flowing down a mountain, your strategic positioning should be persistent in direction, but flexible en route. The mountain remains constant, providing the overall objective, but the path the water takes must adapt to the terrain it encounters along the way. Remember, the strongest positions are those that can evolve without losing their essential character. Those who master adaptive positioning become like water, seemingly soft and yielding, yet capable of wearing away the hardest obstacles through persistent, flexible application of force. The 5 polished stones I used to train my generals represent the most important realization of my later career. That individual strategic mastery means nothing if you cannot multiply your impact by developing strategic thinking in others. These teaching stones remind me that the greatest positioning achievement isn't creating your own advantage, but creating a culture where everyone around you thinks and acts strategically. As my reputation grew and my responsibilities expanded, I discovered that my personal strategic abilities had become a bottleneck. I could position myself effectively, but I couldn't be everywhere at once. My forces were winning battles when I was present to guide them, but struggling when they had to operate independently. I realized that unless I could teach others to think strategically, my own positioning mastery would ultimately limit rather than expand my influence. The challenge of developing strategic thinking in others proved more difficult than mastering strategy myself. My generals were brave and competent, skilled in tactics and experienced in combat, but they had learned to execute orders rather than think independently about positioning. When faced with unexpected situations, they defaulted to conventional responses rather than strategic innovation. I began experimenting with different teaching methods, eventually developing a system based on the 5 stones that represented the core elements of strategic thinking. Each stone represented a different aspect of positioning that could be learned and practiced systematically. The first stone represented situational awareness, the ability to read terrain, both physical and organizational. I taught my officers to spend time before any engagement studying not just the immediate tactical situation, but the broader context that would influence outcomes. In your workplace, this means understanding not just your specific responsibilities, but the organizational dynamics, competitive pressures, and strategic priorities that shape everyone's behavior. The second stone represented opportunity recognition, skill of identifying potential advantages that others miss. I trained my generals to look for asymmetries, timing windows, and resource imbalances that could be leveraged strategically. This required them to think beyond conventional approaches and consider possibilities that weren't immediately obvious. The third stone represented resource optimization, understanding how to get maximum impact from available capabilities. Many of my officers had learned to work with whatever resources they were given, but strategic thinking requires actively positioning yourself to acquire better resources or use existing resources more effectively. The fourth stone represented adaptation and flexibility, the ability to modify approaches when circumstances change. I discovered that this was often the hardest skill to teach because it required my officers to override their natural preference for consistency and predictability. The fifth stone represented teaching others, the recognition that individuals' strategic mastery must be shared to achieve lasting impact. The most strategically positioned people understand that their success depends on developing strategic thinking throughout their network. The breakthrough came when I realized that strategic thinking can't be taught through lectures or manuals. It must be developed through guided practice with real consequences. I began giving my officers increasing responsibility for strategic decisions, providing coaching and feedback rather than direct orders. This approach transformed not just individual performance, but the entire culture of my forces. Officers who had previously waited for detailed instructions began anticipating needs and creating advantages independently. The strategic mindset spread throughout the ranks as each level taught the next. In your modern workplace, this same principle applies whether you're managing a team, mentoring colleagues, or simply trying to create a more strategic culture around yourself. The people who achieve the greatest positioning advantages are those who help others think more strategically, rather than hoarding strategic insights for themselves. When you teach someone else to position themselves effectively, you create an ally who understands strategic thinking and can support your own positioning efforts. When you help your team develop strategic capabilities, you multiply your own impact and create a competitive advantage that goes beyond individual performance. The irony is that sharing strategic knowledge makes you more valuable, not less. Organizations desperately need people who can think strategically and develop that capability in others. By teaching positioning skills, you position yourself as someone who creates strategic value throughout the organization. Remember, the master strategist's greatest victory is creating other strategists who can achieve what the master alone could never accomplish. The eternal strategy scroll beside my bed contains my final thoughts on the enduring nature of strategic positioning, principles that have outlasted empires, survived the rise and fall of dynasties, and remain as relevant today as they were 25 centuries ago. As I reflect on a lifetime spent studying and applying these concepts, I want to leave you with the understanding that strategic positioning isn't just about achieving success. It's about living with intentionality and wisdom. Looking back across decades of campaigns, victories, and defeats, I see that the moments of greatest satisfaction weren't necessarily the most spectacular triumphs, but the quiet instances when strategic thinking transformed impossible situations into manageable challenges. The real power of positioning lies not in dominating others, but in creating circumstances where everyone can succeed while you achieve your objectives. I have watched empires crumble because their leaders confused temporary tactical advantages with permanent strategic position. I have seen brilliant individuals fail because they mastered techniques without understanding principles. Most importantly, I have learned that the deepest strategic positioning comes from aligning your actions with timeless truths about human nature, change, and the dynamics of competition and cooperation. These principles, knowing yourself and your competition, choosing your terrain wisely, timing your actions precisely, building strategic relationships, adapting to changing circumstances, These aren't just military concepts or business tactics. They are fundamental patterns that govern how advantage is created and maintained in any human endeavor. Your personal call to action begins with honest self-assessment. Use the mirror of self-mastery to see yourself clearly, acknowledging both your authentic strengths and your genuine limitations. Build your positioning strategy on this foundation of truth rather than on wishful thinking or self-deception. Next, begin studying the terrain of your own life and career with the same intensity that I studied ancient battlefields. Map the relationships that matter. Identify the resources available to you. Understand the competitive dynamics you face, and recognize the opportunities that others are missing. Practice strategic patience. In our age of instant communication and rapid change, the ability to wait for the right moment has become even more valuable than it was in my time. Resist the pressure to act immediately on every opportunity. Instead, position yourself systematically for the opportunities that truly matter. Build alliances based on mutual benefit and genuine respect. The most enduring strategic advantages come from relationships where everyone prospers. Avoid the temptation to position yourself at others' expense when you could position yourself for everyone's benefit. Most importantly, commit to teaching these principles to others. The legacy of strategic positioning isn't measured by individual victories, but by the multiplication of strategic thinking throughout your sphere of influence. When you help others position themselves effectively, you create a network of strategic thinkers who can achieve far more together than any individual could accomplish alone. The transformation awaiting those who master these principles extends beyond professional advancement or competitive success. Strategic positioning, properly understood, becomes a way of life that brings clarity to decision-making, confidence in uncertain times, and the deep satisfaction that comes from living with intentionality rather than merely reacting to circumstances. As I complete these teachings, I offer you my final blessing. May you find the wisdom to see situations clearly, the courage to position yourself strategically, the patience to wait for the right moments, the strength to act decisively when those moments arrive, and the generosity to share these gifts with others who can benefit from strategic thinking. The ACOM principles are eternal, but their application is uniquely yours. Take what I have shared, adapt it to your circumstances, and make it part of your legacy. The battlefield may have changed from ancient China to your modern world, but the fundamentals, dynamics of strategic positioning remain constant. Use them wisely, and they will serve you well. Your strategic journey begins now.